He left her at the altar without explanation. 5 years later, reappeared, but not to apologize, but because a huge fortune demanded that he have a legal family. Will she forgive, or turn it all around to protect her four children? The scent of lilies filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of an organ playing in the distance. Light poured through the tall cathedral windows, scattering across the polished floors in a mosaic of gold and blue. It was supposed to be the most beautiful day of Juliet Meyer's life. Instead, it would become the day everything broke. Inside, the bridal suite. Juliet stood motionless in front of the mirror. She wore an ivory gown with delicate lace sleeves that hugged her arms and flowed gently to the floor. Her hair, pinned up in soft curls, framed a face that tried hard to hide, the creeping sense of dread rising in her chest. She adjusted her veil once more, hands trembling slightly, the final act in a ritual meant to crown her as a bride. But something felt wrong. It had felt wrong for the last hour. "He's probably just making sure everything is perfect," said Raina, her best friend and maid of honor, trying to offer a reassuring smile as she checked her phone again. "You know how Evan gets. Details, details, details." But even as she said it, her tone didn't carry conviction. Evan Langston wasn't just punctual. He was obsessively timely, especially when it came to things that mattered. And nothing had ever mattered more than this, or so Juliet had believed. She looked at the antique clock on the wall. It was 15 minutes past the scheduled start time of the ceremony. The silence in the room began to thicken. Juliet tried to shake off the feeling. She told herself that the groom being late was a tired movie trope. It didn't happen in real life, certainly not in hers. She and Evan had known each other for years. Their love had taken root in long, late-night conversations, in long-distance phone calls, in walks along the coast, and dreams whispered into each other's hands. They had survived challenges, Evan's grueling career in tech, Juliet's move across the country to be with him, the public attention that came with his wealth. None of that had broken them. So where was he? A knock on the door shattered the silence. Raina hurried over and opened it. A hush fell as the priest stepped inside, his expression solemn, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Juliet didn't need to hear a word. She knew. She felt it. "Miss Myers," the priest said softly, "I'm so sorry. We've received word. Evan won't be coming." Time fractured. The sound of her own heartbeat thundered in Juliet's ears. She felt the blood drain from her face, her legs weakening as she reached instinctively for the edge of the vanity to steady herself. There was no explanation, no phone call, no note, only absence, only silence. Tears welled in her eyes as Raina rushed to her side, but she couldn't bear to be touched. Her throat burned as she tried to speak. This has to be a mistake. He wouldn't do this. But even as the words left her lips, she realized she didn't believe them. Before anyone could respond, Juliet lifted her gown, gathered its weight in her hands, and walked out of the room. The doors to the sanctuary opened, and all eyes turned toward her. Murmurs spread across the pews like a storm. People gasped, some stood, some looked away out of shame for witnessing a moment not meant to be public. Juliet didn't stop. She walked straight down the aisle, alone. Not toward a promise, but away from one. When she reached the massive cathedral doors, she pushed them open and stepped into the blinding afternoon light. The parking lot was empty. No car. No driver. No Evan. She stood there, heartbreaking, surrounded by flowers, expensive decor, and the quiet murmur of confused guests behind her. The sky was bright and clear, indifferent to her unraveling. And then she remembered. 2 weeks earlier. A moment she had dismissed at the time. They were sitting on a bench overlooking the harbor, just after dinner. Evan had held her hand tightly, but his expression was distant. The silence between them stretched too long, too wide. "Are you sure this is what you want?" he had asked. Juliet had laughed, light and sure. "Of course I am. We've waited so long for this." He had nodded, but his smile hadn't reached his eyes. Back then, she'd chalked it up to nerves, cold feet, pressure. But now, she saw it for what it was. A warning. One she hadn't wanted to recognize. She made it to the edge of the lot and sat down hard on the curb, her white dress pooled around her like a crumpled paper swan. Mascara streaked down her cheeks. She didn't bother wiping it away. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. Across the street, hidden behind a line of hedges, Evan sat in the back of a sleek black car. He had arrived. He had seen her, and he had stayed in the car. His mother's voice still echoed in his head from a call the night before. "This wedding will ruin you. That girl, she doesn't belong in your world. She doesn't understand what's at stake. Walk away while you still can." And he had. Not because he didn't love Juliet, but because he was afraid of losing his inheritance, afraid of alienating his powerful family, afraid of building a life that didn't fit the image his parents had crafted for him. He lowered his head and watched Juliet cry alone on the pavement. Guilt gnawed at him. He didn't have the courage to get out of the car. He didn't have the words. So he stayed hidden, a ghost of the man she thought he was. Back on the curb, Juliet slowly stood. She wiped her face, straightened her gown, looked up at the sky. She would not beg. She would not chase after a man who had already chosen to walk away. Something inside her hardened, not into bitterness, but into clarity. She would not be defined by his absence. That night, she returned to her apartment. She packed a single suitcase, left her wedding dress crumpled on the floor. There were no grand declarations, no social media posts, no explanations. She simply boarded a bus the next morning, headed in the opposite direction of everything familiar. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stay where her future had died. The bus rattled through city streets, then through farmland, then along the coast. At every stop, people got on and off. Conversations sparked and died. Babies cried. Radios played faintly in the background. And Juliet sat in silence, staring out the window, holding the ruins of a life she had built in her hands. By the time she reached Seabrook, a quiet coastal town tucked between hills and sea, she had nothing left but determination. She rented a small attic room above a coffee shop and found work as a barista. She didn't talk about the wedding. When customers asked where she was from, she simply said, "Just passing through." She spent her days frothing milk, learning how to stack pastries perfectly, and pretending her life had always been this quiet. Her nights were lonelier. Sometimes she woke up crying, not even remembering the dream that triggered it. But she kept going. Then, a few weeks later, something began to change. She started feeling lightheaded in the mornings. Her body ached in unfamiliar ways. Her appetite vanished, replaced by waves of nausea that no amount of peppermint tea could fix. At first, she assumed it was stress, exhaustion, the aftermath of emotional trauma. But something deeper told her it was more. One night after her shift, she walked into a late-night pharmacy, bought a test, sat in her tiny bathroom under flickering light, waited. The 2 pink lines appeared almost instantly. Juliet stared at them for a long time. Her body didn't move. Her mind didn't race. It was a quiet realization. A child. No. 4 children. She found that out a week later, during her first appointment at the local clinic. The doctor had smiled warmly and said, "Congratulations, Miss Myers. You're expecting quadruplets." The world tilted. 4 heartbeats inside her. 4 reasons to rise again. Juliet left the clinic with her hand pressed to her stomach, her head spinning, her heart cracking open in a new way. She was still alone, still abandoned, still healing. But now she had something more. She had a future, not the one she had planned, but one she would build with her own hands. And this time, no one would take it from her. The days in Seabrook fell into a rhythm, quiet, deliberate, and often lonely. The small town embraced Juliet in a way the city never had. It asked no questions. It offered no judgment. People greeted her with polite smiles and kept their curiosity to themselves. In that gentle anonymity, she found space to breathe. Her tiny home on the edge of town was barely big enough for one person, let alone the changes coming. But Juliet made it work. She washed second-hand baby clothes late into the night, her swollen belly resting against the laundry basket. She read parenting books until her eyes burned and fell asleep to the sound of distant waves breaking on the shore. She never spoke Evan's name again. Not aloud. Not even to herself. He became part of another life, one that ended the moment he chose silence over love. The pregnancy was difficult. Her body stretched beyond its limits. Every movement took effort, and every breath carried weight. There were nights she sat in the bathtub cradling her belly, whispering to the 4 little hearts inside her, "You're not alone, I'm here. We're going to make it." When the boys were born, it was chaos and miracle all at once. The delivery was complicated, her body exhausted before the 3rd baby had arrived. She barely remembered holding the 4th before darkness took her. But when she woke, they were there. All 4 of them, tucked into warm hospital blankets, tiny fists curled, eyes blinking into the world. Micah, Noah, Eli, Ethan. She chose names that carried meaning, soft syllables for a harsh world. Micah was the first to cry, with a fierce strength that surprised the nurses. Noah, quiet and observant, opened his eyes and studied her face. Eli refused to sleep unless Juliet's fingers wrapped around his. And Ethan, the smallest, had a grip like iron and lungs to match. They were everything she didn't know she needed. The hospital released her 2 weeks later. Her home was still modest, the crib legs uneven and the kitchen sink perpetually dripping, but it became a sanctuary. She hung mobiles made from old string and paper stars. She turned bedtime into a ritual of whispered songs and lullabies borrowed from her own childhood. The first year was a blur of bottles, diapers, and exhaustion so deep it carved itself into her bones. There were nights she cried, not from sadness, but from sheer fatigue, rocking 2 babies with one arm while reaching for the other 2 with the other. But every smile, every giggle, every sleepy head nestled into her neck reminded her that she hadn't just survived. She had created something extraordinary. By the time the boys turned 5, they were a whirlwind of energy and imagination. Their personalities had bloomed into distinct and vibrant colors. Micah was the thinker, always asking why. He took apart toy trucks and tried to rebuild them with spoons and duct tape. Noah was the dreamer. He carried around a notebook filled with stars and aliens, sketching his own galaxies. Eli, precise and determined, liked order. He lined up his toys by size and color and insisted on brushing his teeth, exactly when the clock says 6:30. And Ethan, ever the spark, climbed anything with a flat surface and danced before he walked. Juliet found herself laughing, more. Not because life had grown easier, it hadn't, but because joy had taken root in unexpected places, in burnt pancakes, mismatched socks, in morning cuddles and spontaneous puppet shows. Her life, once marked by abandonment and pain, now beat with the rhythm of these 4 little souls who called her Mom. She had built a world for them, a fragile, beautiful one. And then one afternoon, that world trembled. It was a sunny Saturday, the kind that made the town feel like it was holding its breath between seasons. Juliet packed a bag of snacks, water bottles, and spare clothes, standard gear for an afternoon at the park with 4 energetic boys. They ran ahead of her, laughter echoing off the trees. She sat on a worn bench, sunglasses on, a book in her lap that she wasn't really reading. She watched them, her sons, her heart. And then something shifted. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a figure sitting on a bench across the field. At first, it was nothing. Just a man in a light blue shirt, legs crossed, watching the children play. But then he turned his head, and time stopped. It was Evan. He looked different, but not unfamiliar. Older, the lines on his face deeper. His posture, less composed. He sat like a man burdened by something invisible and enormous. For a moment she thought she was hallucinating. Her breath caught in her chest, and her stomach flipped. He was watching the boys. And she saw it, the recognition in his eyes. Not just surprise or curiosity. Recognition. As if some primal part of him had seen his own reflection in the curve of their smiles or the tilt of their heads. Juliet stood, her body moving before her mind could catch up. She called out to her sons, her voice sharper than she intended. "Boys, it's time to go." They protested, of course, whines and groans and pleads for 5 more minutes. "Now," she said, a little louder. The boys began to gather their things. She bent to pick up Micah's toy when she heard footsteps. Approaching. She straightened slowly, and there he was. Closer now. Real. "Juliet," he said. His voice. That voice. It hadn't changed. She stared at him, every nerve in her body screaming to move, to protect, to shield. He took a step forward. "Are they yours?" She looked at him hard. Her eyes didn't flinch. "Yes." He hesitated, glancing at the boys. "How old are they?" She didn't blink. 5. Evan's jaw tightened. His eyes searched hers, desperate, but uncertain. "They're mine," he said, barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question. Juliet didn't answer. Micah, sensing tension, came to her side. "Mommy, who is this?" Juliet placed her hand on his shoulder. "Just someone I used to know." Evan knelt down, meeting Micah's curious gaze. "Hi there, I'm Evan. I knew your mom a long time ago." Micah nodded slowly, then turned to Juliet. "Can we go now?" She nodded, and they began to walk away. Evan stood frozen. "Juliet, please," he called after her. "Let me explain. Just a few minutes." She turned, her voice low and fierce. "You left me on my wedding day. You disappeared without a word. And now, 5 years later, you show up at a park and think a conversation will fix that?" He looked stricken. "I didn't know about them," he said. "If I had, you would have what?" she snapped. "Not vanished. Not let your mother decide who you could love. Not hide in a car while I sobbed in the street." Silence stretched between them. She shook her head. "You don't get to rewrite the story, Evan. You weren't there. For the pregnancy, the birth, the sleepless nights, the scraped knees, the first steps, the fevers, the nightmares. You missed it all." "I know," he whispered. "And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The boys were watching now, uncertain. Juliet took a breath, stealing. Herself. "You don't get to claim them just because you share DNA. Being a father isn't biology. It's presence. It's sacrifice. It's love. You were none of those things." She turned to leave. And yet, as she walked away, something flickered behind her ribs. Not forgiveness, but a question. What now? That night, after the boys had fallen, asleep in a tangle of limbs and laughter, Juliet stood by their door and listened to them breathe. She couldn't sleep. In the kitchen, she stared at the cup of tea she hadn't touched. Evan had found them. Found her. Everything she had built now stood at the edge of something unknown. She didn't know what he wanted. She didn't know what she was willing to give. But she knew one thing with unwavering certainty. She would protect her children, no matter the cost, no matter what history tried to return, no matter who came knocking. The days that followed were filled with a tense silence, the kind that wraps itself around the walls of a home and quietly alters its temperature. Nothing had changed outwardly. The boys still laughed in the mornings. They still spilled milk and chased each other down the hall and left mismatched socks beneath the couch. But Juliet felt the shift. It was as if a breeze from the past had entered the home and refused to leave, trailing with it the scent of uncertainty. Evan had returned. Not with anger, not with demands, but with something more unsettling, intent. He had asked to see the boys again, just for an hour, a coffee shop, a walk in the park. Juliet refused. She wasn't ready, not after 5 years of absence, not after 5 years of shouldering everything alone. She didn't know what frightened her more, the idea that Evan might walk away again, or the chance that this time he might stay. 2 weeks passed without contact. Then one afternoon, a knock came at her door. Juliet opened it and was greeted not by Evan, but by a man in a gray suit with kind eyes and a folder in his hand. "Ms. Myers?" he asked gently. "Yes?" "I'm here to serve you legal documents. Mr. Evan Langston has filed a petition for partial custody of your children." The world tilted slightly beneath her feet. She closed the door slowly, the papers pressed against her chest. For a long moment she didn't move. The boys were napping. The house was quiet. Outside, wind rustled through the trees, indifferent to the storm that had just erupted inside her. That evening, Juliet called Grace. Grace had once been a classmate, now a respected family lawyer in a neighboring city. They hadn't spoken in years, but when Grace answered the phone and heard the tremble in Juliet's voice, she said only one thing: "I'm on my way." The next morning, Grace sat at Juliet's kitchen table, reviewing the custody documents, with a pen tapping rhythmically against her notepad. "He's not asking for full custody," she said, "but he is petitioning for joint legal and scheduled physical custody. He wants visitation rights. He's claiming he's changed, that he has the means to support them, that his absence, while regrettable, does not disqualify him from being a father now." Juliet stared down at her hands. They were calloused, strong, tired. "What do I do, Grace?" "You fight," Grace said simply. "You don't have his money, but you have something stronger. You've been there for your boys every moment of their lives. We're not just going to defend that. We're going to prove it." In the weeks that followed, Juliet's life became a whirlwind of preparation. Grace helped her gather every piece of documentation: medical records, school reports, photos, letters from teachers, neighbors, anyone who could testify to the life she had built. She kept working at the cafe in the mornings, tucking away every dollar for legal fees. At night, she stayed up late filling out forms while the boys slept in their shared room, unaware that the stability of their world hung in a balance they couldn't see. The first hearing came on a crisp morning in early spring. Juliet wore a navy blue dress, simple but elegant. Her hair was pulled back. She held her breath the entire drive to the courthouse. Grace sat beside her, calm and steady. Inside, the courtroom felt too bright, too clinical. Evan was already there, seated on the other side, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed to fit him too perfectly. He stood when Juliet entered, a small gesture that did nothing to soothe the chasm between them. Their eyes met. For a brief moment, Juliet saw something flicker in his expression. Regret, maybe. Or fear. But then the judge entered, and the trial began. Evan's attorney spoke first. His voice was polished, his tone measured. He laid out a picture of a man who had made a mistake and now sought redemption. He detailed Evan's financial stability, his willingness to support the children's education, healthcare, emotional needs. He referenced Evan's recent efforts to reconnect, painting them as evidence of genuine transformation. Juliet felt her hands tightening into fists beneath the table. Then it was Grace's turn. She stood, tall and deliberate. "Your Honor," she began, "my client doesn't have millions in the bank. She doesn't own a corporation. But she has something far more powerful. She has history. She has proof. She has a record of love." With each word, Grace outlined Juliet's journey. How she carried 4 children alone, worked 2 jobs while nursing them through fevers, built a life for them from the ground up. She described the emotional scars of abandonment and the quiet strength Juliet had shown every day since. Then she called Juliet to the stand. The room fell still. Juliet took a slow breath and stepped forward. Her voice shook at first, but then steadied. "I was left on my wedding day," she said plainly. "I didn't know why. I still don't. I didn't chase after him. I didn't call him. I packed my things and started over, because I had to. Not just for me, but for them." She glanced at the stack of photos on the table. Pictures of the boys laughing in a park, decorating cupcakes, asleep in her arms. "I've been their everything," she continued. "I've been their protector, their provider, their comfort. I'm not saying Evan doesn't deserve a chance, but parenting isn't a job you walk into 5 years late and expect to be handed a desk. It's earned, and I haven't seen him earn it." Her voice faltered. She swallowed. "I want what's best for my sons. I always have. But what scares me is losing the stability we've built. What scares me is introducing them to someone who might not stay." The judge nodded, scribbling notes, expression unreadable. After a brief recess, Grace approached Juliet with a careful look. "There's something else," she said quietly. "We've located someone willing to testify on your behalf. Someone from Evan's past, a housekeeper who worked for his family for over 2 decades. Juliet blinked. "Who?" "Her name is Eleanor Riley. She was there during the weeks before your wedding, and she has a lot to say." The court reconvened, and Eleanor was brought in. She was small, older, her back slightly stooped. But her voice, when she began to speak, was clear and firm. "I remember what happened 5 years ago," she said. "I remember the conversations. Evan's mother was furious that he wanted to marry Juliet. She said she wasn't polished enough, didn't have the right family, the right pedigree. She threatened to cut Evan off completely. And there was someone else there too. Tasha." At the mention of the name, Evan stiffened. "She encouraged it," Eleanor continued. "Said Juliet would ruin his image, that he needed to think about his future. I overheard it all. I said nothing then. I was afraid. But I'm not afraid now." Juliet closed her eyes. Her hands trembled in her lap. The truth had finally stepped into the light. Evan's face was pale when he stood to speak. The judge allowed it, though the room was on edge. "I should have said something," Evan admitted. "I was weak. I let them control me. I let fear stop me from standing by someone I loved. But I'm not that man anymore. I can't erase the past. But I want to do right by my sons. I want to earn my place, not take it, earn it." The judge called for a temporary decision, one that would stand until further evaluations could be made. The final ruling would take weeks. But the interim result came that day. Primary custody would remain with Juliet. Evan would be granted supervised visits once a week. Outside the courthouse, Juliet stood quietly beneath a tree, watching the wind stir the leaves. Evan approached her cautiously. "I know this doesn't fix anything," he said, "but thank you for letting them see me, even a little." Juliet looked at him. Her voice was low but steady. "You're here now. That matters. But it won't matter if you leave again. Don't make promises you're not ready to keep." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "We'll see," she replied. Then she walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement, echoing louder than any goodbye. That night, she tucked the boys into bed as she always did. One kiss, one whisper, one soft stroke of hair. But something in her heart was shifting. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something quieter. Possibility. The days following the hearing settled into something that resembled rhythm, but not peace. Juliet's home still echoed with laughter. The morning rush of cereal bowls clinking, mismatched socks and backpack. Zippers zipping. But beneath it all lived a subtle tension, an invisible thread winding through her ribs, tugging every time the doorbell rang, every time the boys asked questions she wasn't ready to answer. Evan had been granted supervised visitation once a week. It wasn't much. It wasn't nothing. It was somewhere between the two, and Juliet wasn't sure how she felt about that space. The boys had questions, of course. They were children, curious and intuitive in ways that adults often forget to be. Micah had asked first. "Mommy, was that man at the park?" Juliet had taken a deep breath before answering. "His name is Evan. He's someone from before you were born." "Is he nice?" Noah asked. Juliet hesitated. "He's trying to be." They didn't ask if he was their father. Not yet. Perhaps they sensed the weight of that truth and the silence wrapped around it. Perhaps they didn't need to ask. In the mirrored shapes of their faces, the curve of Evan's jaw echoed in all four of them. The first visit happened on a Sunday. The boys had spent the morning picking dandelions in the yard while Juliet laid out a picnic blanket beneath the willow tree. It was neutral ground, open, safe, visible. Evan arrived right on time, dressed in a faded t-shirt and jeans, a marked departure from the polished image he once carried like armor. He came with nothing but a storybook and a set of paper airplanes he'd made by hand. Juliet watched from the porch, arms crossed, every part of her poised to step in if needed. But Evan didn't try to dazzle. He didn't push. He sat on the blanket, cross-legged, and waited. Micah approached first. He was the bravest, or perhaps the most skeptical. Evan offered him an airplane and said, "Want to see how far it can go?" Micah nodded without smiling and tossed it across the lawn. It soared. Ethan predictably chased after it. Within minutes, all four boys were gathered around him, laughing, folding paper, adjusting wings, launching tiny crafts into the wind. Juliet couldn't help but watch and wonder. Evan stayed for an hour. At the end, he stood and looked toward the porch. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for letting me be here." She didn't answer. She only nodded. But it was something. The visits became routine. Each Sunday, Evan arrived. Sometimes he brought books, sometimes puzzles. One weekend he brought a simple kite, and they spent the afternoon chasing it through the park, the string slipping from Micah's hands as the boys howled with laughter. Juliet still didn't let him inside the house. Not yet. The door was a boundary she wasn't ready to cross. But she began to linger closer to the yard during visits, folding laundry near the open window or weeding the garden just within earshot. And slowly, the guarded walls inside her began to shift. Evan never once asked for more time, never once questioned her rules. He showed up, stayed within the lines she drew, and when the hour ended, he left. Always with a quiet thank you, always with the unspoken knowledge that trust, once shattered, is not something you demand back. It is something you earn, grain by grain, over time. The boys adjusted in their own ways. Eli began drawing pictures of the man with the airplanes and taping them to the fridge. Noah asked if Evan could read his stories next time. Micah kept his questions to himself, watching Evan closely, weighing his every move with an intensity beyond his years. And Ethan, the wild, bright flame, had already begun calling him E. Juliet didn't correct him. She wasn't ready to call Evan Dad either. One evening, after a particularly long day, Juliet stood at the sink washing dishes as the boys played in the next room. She was tired, always tired, but something about this day felt heavier than usual. Evan had stayed a few minutes longer, helping Ethan untangle the strings of a yo-yo, and Juliet hadn't stopped him. That small act, letting him stay, had replayed in her mind all evening. She dried her hands and walked to the living room. The boys were all asleep, curled together like puppies on the floor beneath a pile of blankets. The glow from the lamp cast soft shadows on their faces. Juliet stood there for a long time, just watching them, her heart swollen with something sharp and tender. Then she heard a quiet knock. She opened the door to find Evan standing there, holding a folder. "I didn't mean to bother you," he said quickly. I wanted to give you this." She took the folder. Inside were copies of insurance papers, emergency contact forms, a letter addressed to the boys, and a check. "I know you've never asked for help," he said, "and I'm not trying to fix anything with money, but I want to contribute, even if it's just a little." Juliet stared at the papers. Her fingers tightened. "I'm not asking for permission to be their father," Evan said quietly. "I'm asking for the chance to be someone they can count on, not because I deserve it, but because they deserve it." She didn't speak, not at first. Then softly, "They're happy, and I'm terrified of changing that. I understand. They call you E," she added. Evan smiled, his eyes wet. "That's more than I hoped for." She looked at the check again, then folded it and handed it back. "If you want to help, be here. That's what they need, what they'll remember." He took the check without protest. She watched him walk away, his figure disappearing into the night, and for the first time, she didn't feel anger trailing behind him, only quiet ache. In the following weeks, something unexpected began to take root. Not romance, not yet, but a kind of companionship. Shared ground. A sense that the war between them had given way to something else. The beginning of understanding. Evan started helping more during visits. Fixing the squeaky gate, repainting the fence with mica, reading bedtime stories when Juliet's voice was hoarse from work. He brought homemade trail mix for their park trips, and helped Eli build a cardboard castle complete with drawbridge and tiny guards. He didn't try to step into a role. He tried to stand beside it. And that difference meant everything. Then one evening, just as the boys finished dinner and ran off to prepare for their baths, Evan lingered in the kitchen. Juliet was stirring a pot of soup. He leaned against the counter. "I used to think love was something you could win," he said. "A proposal, a wedding, a house, trophies like milestones. But I look at you, at what you've built, and I realize it's not about the big moments. It's the quiet ones. Showing up, listening, staying." Juliet turned the stove off. "You can't undo what happened." "I don't want to undo it," he said. "I want to build something new. From where we are, not where we were." She didn't answer, but he didn't expect her to. The silence between them had shifted again, not full of pain, but of possibility. That Sunday, Evan brought something different, a photo album from his childhood. He sat with the boys, showing them pictures of his first treehouse, a disastrous science fair volcano, his dog Max. The boys laughed, asked questions, pointed out how much he looked like Micah. Juliet sat in the doorway, watching. Evan caught her eye once and smiled. She didn't look away. Later that evening, after the boys had gone to bed, Juliet opened her bedroom window and let the night air in. The stars were bright, and the world felt still. She sat at her desk and wrote for the first time in years. Not a letter, not a journal. Just a sentence, over and over, until it felt real. Maybe people do change. Maybe trust can be rebuilt. Maybe this is a beginning. And somewhere in the room, the silence nodded its quiet agreement. By the time autumn arrived, the trees outside Juliet's home had turned the color of fire, amber, crimson, and rust swirling through the wind like a living memory. Inside, the boys were painting pumpkins at the kitchen table, their laughter a low hum beneath the patter of rain on the roof. The house smelled of cinnamon and something baking. It was the kind of evening that might have once made Juliet feel lonely. Now it made her feel full. Evan had become part of their routine, though not in any dramatic or invasive way. He didn't try to claim a title. He didn't insist on a place at the table. He showed up week after week with quiet constancy. Sometimes with a new book. Sometimes with nothing but time. He remembered which of the boys hated crust on their sandwiches, which one needed encouragement before spelling tests, which one cried when the dog next door barked too loudly. Juliet noticed the way the boys had started to lean into him more naturally. She noticed how her own guard had begun to lower, not with trust fully restored, but with a kind of gentle curiosity. Not every wound needed to be opened to remain real. Some scars lived quietly, no longer burning, and somewhere along the line, the anger had stopped screaming inside her. It had become a murmur, faint and far away. One evening, as they were cleaning up dinner, Evan lingered in the kitchen. He stood beside her at the sink, handing her rinsed dishes. It was simple and unremarkable, but something about the way he moved, confident, but not controlling, present, but not pressing, reminded her of the life they might have once imagined before it all fell apart. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if things had gone differently?" he asked quietly. She didn't look up from the dish she was scrubbing. "I used to. Every day. I don't anymore." Evan nodded slowly. "I do. And lately I've been thinking, maybe this is the way it was meant to happen. Not perfect, but honest. Built piece by piece." She dried her hands and turned to him. "What are you saying, Evan?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. It wasn't a ring box. It wasn't flowers or a dramatic gesture. Just a notebook, the pages dog-eared and soft with time. "I've been writing in this since the day I left the courthouse," he said. "Letters to the boys, to you. Things I never said. Things I should have said years ago." He handed it to her. "You don't have to read it now or ever, but it's yours. All of it." She took the notebook, her fingers brushing against his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. A week later, they took the boys on a weekend trip to a nearby forest preserve. It wasn't a fancy getaway, just tents, flashlights, and a cooler full of sandwiches. But for the boys, it was magic. They built a campfire with Evan, toasted marshmallows until they melted off the stick, and stayed up late making shadow puppets against the tent walls. Juliet lay awake that night, listening to the quiet breathing. Around her, 4 small chests rising and falling, and just beyond, Evan's quiet presence keeping watch outside. She hadn't said yes. She hadn't said anything. But something in her had shifted again, not all at once. Not like falling, but like thawing. That following Monday, the boys were invited to speak at school about their families. The assignment was simple. Bring a photo of someone important and say why they mattered. Each boy chose a different picture, some with Juliet, some with all 4 of them at the beach. But it was Eli who surprised her. He stood in front of the class holding a drawing he had made himself. It was of their backyard, the fence half-painted, the grass uneven, the sky filled with stars. "This is my family," he said, pointing to 4 stick-figure boys, a woman with curly hair and a tall man with a messy scribble of a beard. "This is my mom. She's strong and nice. This is us, and this is Evan, He helps us paint and fly kites. He reads stories and makes grilled cheese. He's not just a visitor anymore." Juliet, who had been sitting in the back of the classroom, felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She hadn't expected that, hadn't asked for it. But it was there, in crayon and paper, in the unfiltered honesty of a child. Evan was becoming part of their world. Not because he had insisted, but because he had stayed. That night, after the boys had gone to sleep, Juliet stood in the doorway of the guest room Evan had started using for overnights. He was folding laundry, a task he had once found overwhelming, but now did without complaint. "I read your notebook," she said quietly. He turned to her, unsure. "There was a line," she continued, stepping inside. "You wrote, 'I spent years wanting to be forgiven before I'd even earned it. But love isn't a reward. It's a responsibility.'" Evan exhaled slowly. "It took me a long time to understand that," she nodded, folding her arms. "I don't have an answer yet. I don't know if I ever will, but I wanted you to know. I'm not afraid of the idea anymore." He didn't move closer, didn't reach for her. He just said, "That's enough for me." The holidays came with unexpected softness. Evan helped hang lights on the front porch while Micah directed from below with a clipboard and a whistle. Noah made decorations from old cereal boxes. Ethan managed to pull down the tree twice before they gave up and tied it to the wall. Eli wrote a Christmas card addressed to Mom and Evan for being a good team. On New Year's Eve, after the boys had fallen asleep in a pile of sleeping bags on the living room floor, Juliet and Evan sat on the porch wrapped in a single blanket. Snowflakes fell like ash in the dark. Neither spoke for a long time. Then, Juliet turned to him. "I used to think forgiveness meant pretending the pain never happened," she said. "Now I think maybe it's just making room for something better to grow beside it." Evan took her hand gently. "If that's true, then everything I've done has been for that space, that chance." And finally, Juliet leaned her head against his shoulder. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't an answer. But it was something close. The following spring, the boys helped Evan build a new treehouse in the backyard. They spent every weekend working together, measuring, hammering, repainting the ladder 3 times, because Ethan insisted it be green, then red, then blue. One Sunday afternoon, after the final nail had been placed, Evan climbed down, wiped his hands on his jeans, and turned to Juliet. "Come see," he said. She followed him up the narrow steps into a small wooden room filled with pillows, handprints, and mismatched curtains sewn from old T-shirts. In the corner was a note carved into the wall. "Our family lives here." Juliet stared at the words. Her throat tightened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it, not as a hope, but as a truth. That evening, with the sun setting behind them and the treehouse glowing with fairy lights, Evan knelt down in the yard. The boys were watching, holding sparklers, giggling. He didn't bring out a ring. He didn't rehearse a speech. He simply looked up at her and said, "We've been building this for years, not with wood, with trust, with mistakes and second chances. Will you build the rest of it with me?" Juliet didn't hesitate. "Yes," she whispered. The boys exploded with cheers. Noah dropped his sparkler. Ethan jumped into Evan's arms. Micah tried to climb the treehouse ladder with one shoe on, and Juliet, standing there in the fading light, knew that this imperfect, hard-earned, deeply felt life was the one she had been meant to build all along, not the one she dreamed of at 22, but the one that could hold her now. Just when it seemed like everything was finally falling into place, the unexpected came knocking, this time in the form of a letter. It arrived on a rainy Tuesday, tucked between bills and neighborhood flyers. Juliet almost threw it out, until she saw the return address, a law firm in New York. Curious and uneasy, she opened it slowly. Inside was a formal notice. Evan's late father had left behind a hidden trust, one that could only be accessed if Evan could legally prove he had a stable, intact family. The sum was staggering, life-changing. But the condition was clear: a family, on paper, a legal marriage, a signed commitment. Juliet stared at the letter, her heart pounding. Suddenly, their slow, tender healing wasn't just emotional. It was under scrutiny. Would Evan still want her if no money were involved? Could their growing love survive the shadows of legacy and pressure? This letter would test everything: trust, intention, and whether what they had built was real or still fragile. Want to know how Juliet responds, what Evan chooses, and whether love can survive even this? Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next emotional chapter. Your support helps us bring you more powerful, heart-tugging stories like this.